They reset Tartaria and called it the Industrial Revolution's vertical bar length. Approximately 20,000 characters vertical bar style. Third-person narrative documentary Faithy official story presents the Industrial Revolution as humanity's great leap forward. A time when brilliant inventors suddenly discovered steam power, mass production, and mechanized industry. When factories rose from farmland and railways stretched across continents. When human ingenuity supposedly transformed the world in just a few decades. But the evidence suggests something different. Something darker. Something that requires us to question everything we've been taught about progress, invention, and the true origins of the modern world. The timeline doesn't make sense. Between 1750 and 1850, human civilization allegedly went from predominantly agricultural societies to industrial powerhouses. In a single century, we're told, humanity learned to harness steam, build massive factories, construct railway networks spanning thousands of miles, and erect buildings of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The speed alone should raise questions. Previous technological revolutions took millennia. Agriculture developed over thousands of years. Metallurgy evolved across centuries. Writing systems emerged gradually through generations of refinement. Yet somehow, industrial civilization appeared in a handful of decades. The conventional explanation credits individual inventors. James Watt with the steam engine, George Stephenson with the locomotive. Countless engineers and entrepreneurs whose brilliance supposedly sparked this rapid transformation. But examine the historical record more carefully, and something strange emerges. These inventors weren't creating from nothing. They were improving, adapting, refining technologies that already existed in forms they couldn't quite explain. The buildings tell a different story than the textbooks. Across Europe, across America, across territories that were supposedly primitive frontiers, massive industrial structures appeared with suspicious uniformity, not just similar in style, identical in construction methods, the same architectural mathematics, the same load-bearing techniques, the same sophisticated understanding of materials and engineering. Manchester, England built its cotton mills with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate using appropriate tools. Philadelphia erected factories of such scale and complexity that contemporary accounts expressed amazement, not at the innovation, but at the speed of construction. Chicago, recovering from its Great Fire, rebuilt entire industrial districts in timeframes that seem physically impossible given the technology supposedly available. The official history explains this as rapid knowledge transfer, as shared innovation spreading through industrial societies. But that explanation requires believing that hundreds of separate cities, across multiple continents, with limited communication infrastructure, all independently developed identical construction techniques simultaneously. The coordination problem alone defies probability. What if they didn't build these structures at all? What if they inherited them? The maps provide the critical timeline. In 1750, cartographers across Europe, working independently, all labeled a vast territory across northern and central Asia as Tartary, not as speculation, not as terra incognita, but as an established region with defined borders, marked cities, and indicated governmental structures. French maps show it. Dutch maps show it. British maps show it. Russian maps acknowledge it even as Russian expansion pushed eastward into territories labeled Tartarian. By 1850, the name has vanished. The same cartographic institutions that had marked Tartary for generations suddenly redrew their maps. The territory became Russia in the west, Qing China in the east, various colonial possessions, and empty spaces waiting to be filled by expanding empires. No transition documentation exists, no treaties of dissolution, no contemporary accounts of Tartary's collapse. The civilization simply disappeared from official record. And in that same 100-year window, the Industrial Revolution happened. The exact same period when a continent, spanning civilization, vanished from maps, saw the sudden appearance of industrial infrastructure across the globe. The inheritance theory explains what the innovation theory cannot. Those massive factory buildings that appeared so quickly weren't built during the Industrial Revolution. They were already there. Structures designed and constructed by Tartarian civilization, then inherited, repurposed, and reattributed by the societies that came after. The industrial infrastructure didn't emerge from human ingenuity in the 1800s. It was discovered, claimed, and put to new use. Consider the evidence systematically. Across former Tartarian territories and beyond, industrial structures share architectural features that predate their supposed construction. Buildings allegedly erected in the 1850s contain construction techniques that official history claims weren't developed until decades later. Factories supposedly built with primitive equipment show engineering sophistication that requires advanced mathematical understanding and precision tools that allegedly didn't exist yet. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, officially constructed in stages throughout the 1700s and 1800s, demonstrates construction methods that appear throughout industrial structures worldwide. The same proportion systems, the same architectural mathematics, the same understanding of load distribution. We're told this represents neoclassical revival, a return to classical principles spreading through educated architectural circles. But the uniformity extends beyond style to specific technical implementation, suggesting not shared influence, but common origin. The railway networks present an even deeper mystery. Official history credits the rapid expansion of railways to industrial innovation and capital investment. Between 1830 and 1870, tens of thousands of miles of track appeared across Europe and North America. The conventional narrative describes this as unprecedented construction achievement, driven by private enterprise and engineering brilliance. But examine the railway construction records more carefully. For many major rail lines, detailed construction documentation simply doesn't exist. There are completion ceremonies, official openings, inaugural runs, but the actual building process remains curiously undocumented. Contemporary newspapers report the opening of new rail lines without explaining where they came from or who built them. The infrastructure simply appears, ready for use. What if many railway lines weren't built during the Industrial Revolution but discovered? What if Tartarian civilization had already established transportation networks, and the inheriting societies simply cleared, repaired, and claimed them as new construction? The technology itself raises questions. Steam power, the supposed breakthrough that enabled the Industrial Revolution, wasn't invented in the 1700s. Steam-powered devices existed in ancient Greece. Hero of Alexandria described steam-powered mechanisms in the 1st century. Chinese texts reference steam-powered devices centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The knowledge existed. What changed in the 1800s wasn't the invention of steam power, but its large-scale application using infrastructure that could support it. Infrastructure that might have already existed, waiting to be rediscovered and repurposed. The factory system presents similar anomalies. We're told that factory production was invented during the Industrial Revolution, replacing cottage industry and artisan production. But archaeological evidence suggests large-scale production facilities existed long before the 1800s. Ancient Roman factories produced pottery, metalwork, and textiles on industrial scales. Chinese manufacturing complexes operated centuries before European industrialization. The concept of centralized production wasn't invented in Manchester. It was reinvented, or more accurately, inherited. The reset theory explains the gaps. Sometime in the mid-1700s, Tartarian civilization collapsed. Whether through war, natural catastrophe, or deliberate destruction, the population was killed, displaced, or scattered. The infrastructure remained. Massive stone buildings, railway networks, factory complexes, water systems, electrical infrastructure. All empty, all waiting. The inheriting civilizations, Russian expansion, European colonial powers, American westward movement, discovered these structures and claimed them, but they didn't fully understand them. They saw buildings and assumed decorative purposes for features that were actually functional. They found machinery and misidentified its purpose. They inherited technology they couldn't quite replicate, so they created a new narrative. They backdated their own achievements, claimed Tartarian infrastructure as their own construction, and invented the Industrial Revolution to explain what they had actually inherited. The story of rapid innovation masked the reality of technological inheritance and incomplete understanding. The atmospheric energy systems provide the clearest evidence. Many industrial-era buildings feature architectural elements officially described as decorative, elements that make no sense as mere ornamentation. Elaborate metalwork on rooftops, positioned to maximize height and exposure to sky. Complex geometric patterns in construction that serve no load-bearing purpose. Infrastructure that suggests electrical systems despite official history claiming electricity wasn't harnessed until later. What if these weren't decorative elements but functional components of Tartarian technology? What if the civilization that built these structures understood atmospheric electricity, free energy systems, harmonics, and resonance in ways the inheriting societies didn't comprehend? The Industrial Revolution's sudden appearance of powered machinery might not represent innovation, but the partial reactivation of systems that had always been there, now powered by steam because the inheritors had lost the knowledge of the original power source. The chronology of technological development supports this theory. Steam power became dominant in the early 1800s, precisely when Tartarian infrastructure would have been most readily available for inheritance. But steam is inefficient, requiring constant fuel, maintenance, and producing pollution that earlier technologies might not have generated. What if steam wasn't progress but regression? A crude workaround adopted by societies that had inherited buildings designed for superior power systems they no longer understood. The evidence exists in the structures themselves. Buildings from the supposed early Industrial Revolution often contain spaces that make no sense for steam-powered machinery. Rooms with no ventilation for smoke, no fuel storage, no obvious power transmission mechanisms. Factories where the machinery placement suggests power sources that aren't there anymore, weren't documented, or were removed and forgotten before anyone thought to record them. The workforce narrative reveals another inconsistency. We're told the Industrial Revolution required massive labor forces, driving migration from rural areas to cities. That factory work created new working classes, new social structures, new urban populations. But contemporary accounts describe something different. They describe finding cities, not building them, occupying industrial districts that seem to already exist, moving into housing that appeared designed for different occupants. The architecture supports this. Worker housing from the Industrial Revolution era often features proportions that seem wrong. Ceilings higher than necessary for normal human comfort, doorways taller than practical, staircases with rises that seem excessive. Official history dismisses these as builder's error or period style. But the consistency suggests intentional design for occupants who weren't average height. What if the housing wasn't built for Industrial Revolution workers? What if it was Tartarian residential architecture, designed for a population that included individuals of greater stature, then occupied by inheritors who found it oddly sized but serviceable? The timeline of urban development supports the inheritance theory. Cities that were supposedly small towns in 1750 appear as major urban centers with full infrastructure by 1850. The conventional explanation credits rapid industrialization and population growth, but the actual construction required, the millions of bricks, the thousands of tons of stone, the infrastructure networks, the sheer labor hours, they don't match the population supposedly available or the time frames officially claimed. What if these cities weren't built in the Industrial Revolution? What if they already existed, were found partially abandoned or depopulated, and were simply occupied, renamed, and attributed to the new inhabitants? The photographic record provides evidence. Early photographs from the 1850s and 1860s show cities that look ancient, not new. Buildings with weathering patterns suggesting centuries of exposure. Infrastructure with wear that shouldn't exist on structures supposedly just completed. Urban layouts that suggest organic growth over long periods, not rapid planned development. The official history explains this as revival architecture, as deliberate imitation of classical styles. But that explanation requires believing that hundreds of cities independently decided to build everything to look old, using construction techniques that deliberately mimicked age and wear, at enormous additional cost, with no practical benefit. Or the buildings actually were old, built by a civilization that no longer existed, inherited by societies that needed them but couldn't acknowledge their true origin without admitting they hadn't built the foundations of their own industrial power. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London provides a revealing case study. The Crystal Palace, supposedly designed and built in less than a year, demonstrated construction capabilities that seem impossible for the technology officially available. A massive glass and iron structure, engineered with precision, erected at a speed that modern construction companies struggle to match with contemporary equipment. The conventional explanation credits innovative design and prefabrication. But examine the construction records, and the documentation focuses on assembly, not manufacturing. Where did the glass come from? Who produced the iron components? How were precise measurements achieved across thousands of identical parts? The answers remain vague, attributed to industrial capacity that was supposedly still developing. What if the Crystal Palace wasn't built from scratch? What if it was assembled from components that already existed? Tartarian architectural elements, salvaged, repurposed, and reconstructed into something that could be claimed as British innovation. The industrial exhibitions that followed across Europe and America show similar patterns. Massive structures appearing with suspicious speed, architecture demonstrating capabilities beyond what official technology should allow. Buildings that exist for brief periods, then are demolished, leaving minimal archaeological trace, almost as if they were assembled from inherited materials displayed, then disassembled to prevent too much scrutiny of their true origins. The financial records of the Industrial Revolution reveal another anomaly. The capital investment required for rapid industrialization was enormous, yet the sources of this capital remain unclear. Banking systems that were supposedly primitive somehow financed massive industrial expansion across multiple continents simultaneously. The money came from somewhere, but official records are vague about exact sources and mechanisms. What if the wealth came from inheritance, not just infrastructure, but resources, materials, stockpiles of valuable goods left behind by Tartarian civilization? The sudden availability of capital for industrial investment might represent not economic innovation, but the liquidation of inherited assets converted into currency and reinvested in systems the inheritors understood. The educational systems established during the Industrial Revolution reveal the careful construction of new narratives. Universities expanded, curriculums standardized, history textbooks written and distributed widely, all emphasizing progress, innovation, the brilliance of recent invention, all systematically excluding or minimizing references to earlier civilizations, earlier technologies, earlier achievements that might complicate the story of industrial triumph. This wasn't conspiracy. It was institutional momentum. Societies that had inherited power and infrastructure needed historical narratives that justified their possession. Textbooks that explained the modern world as the natural result of their own achievement, not as inheritance from a forgotten civilization. Education systems that taught what to think about history, not how to question it. The pattern repeats across every institution. Museums displayed artifacts in ways that supported official chronology. Archaeological societies focused on ancient history while treating recent centuries as already understood. Scientific institutions validated technologies while avoiding questions about their true origins, not through coordinated deception, but through collective acceptance of narratives that served institutional interests. The reset wasn't just physical, it was informational. A civilization disappeared, its infrastructure was inherited, and a new story was written. A story called the Industrial Revolution, celebrating human innovation while obscuring the possibility that the industrial world was built on foundations laid by others. By Tartaria, a civilization erased from maps and memory, leaving only its buildings, its technology, its infrastructure, now claimed by inheritors who call it progress, the evidence remains. The architecture that doesn't match the timeline, the technology that appeared too quickly, the cities that grew too fast, the railways that materialized without adequate construction records, the industrial capacity that exceeded what primitive tools should allow. All of it pointing toward inheritance, not invention. They reset Tartaria. They occupied its cities, claimed its buildings, engineered its technology incompletely, and built a new world on its foundations. Then they called it the Industrial Revolution. They called it progress. They called it human achievement. And we believed them. Because the alternative requires accepting that we're living in inherited cities, working with inherited technology, following systems we didn't create, and don't fully understand that what we call advancement might be recovery, that the modern world is younger than we think, built on ruins we're not allowed to see. The buildings stand silent, keeping secrets in their proportions. The timeline remains impossible, explained by narratives that don't hold under scrutiny. And somewhere in the archives, in forgotten maps and buried records, the truth waits. Tartaria existed. Tartaria fell, and we're living in what came after, calling it progress, calling it revolution, never asking where it really came from. The reset happened. The inheritance is real, and the Industrial Revolution might be the greatest rebranding in human history.